right, so we've previously covered what shortcodes are in our definitions and concept section. Now let's create our very own custom shortcode for our plugin. So to do that, let's open up our code editor and let's navigate to the shortcode section of our code here. Hit return a couple times. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function here, function 2.1. This function is going to register our custom shortcodes for this plugin that we're creating. So the name of that function is going to be SSP register shortcodes. So I'm going to add a WordPress function in here. This is called add shortcode. It takes two parameters. The first is the desired shortcode text and then the function that we're going to call. So in this case, we want people to be able to write out something that looks like this example here. So the text that they're going to write out for their shortcode is going to be SSP_survey, and then they're going to pass in an ID. So that's what this is here. We're saying the text we want people to write out is going to be SSP survey, and then this next value here, SSP survey shortcode, this is going to be this shortcode function that's going to get called when this shortcode gets displayed. So we have to create this function now. So that's what we're going to do next. So that's going to be 2.2 here. This is going to actually display our survey, and the name of this function is going to be SSP_survey_shortcode. So this function is actually going to take a couple of arguments. The first is going to be an associative array of arguments called args, and then next it's going to be a variable containing the content that comes in from our shortcode. We'll look into that a little bit more in a little bit. I'm going to default content to be an empty string of text. That's because arguments by default will always exist, but contents won't if somebody doesn't pass in content, sorry. And so we default content to be an empty string so that we're not going to run into any issues in our code assuming that content exists. All right, so in our function, we're going to be building out some HTML that's going to get written to the browser. So we're going to start doing that by creating an output variable, and it's going to be an empty string for now. Then we're going to use a PHP try statement here. And I'll just finish writing that. Okay, so if an error is caught, then we'll be able to handle that error inside this catch portion. Otherwise, we'll run our code up here inside of our try statement. So we're going to start out by building out our HTML now for our output. So to do that, we're going to set our output variable to have an open div tag in it with a class of SSP and SSP-survey. Okay, so then after that, we're going to check to see if a survey ID is being passed into the arguments variable. So we do that here. So this is a shorthand way of doing an if-else statement. So this is the if portion. So if is set arguments ID. So it's checking to see if the ID key exists in our associative array args. Then we want to set survey ID to equal the value of that if it's set. And this right here, we're just casting the value, the result of that value, as an integer. Just in case it's a string by accident or whatever, this will make sure that it converts it into a number. Otherwise, we're going to return the survey ID, default it to 0. So now that we have a survey ID, we can actually query the WordPress database for that post. So we do that by calling the built-in WordPress function getPost, and this is going to query the WP post database table for a post with an ID equal to our survey ID, and then we store the result of that in a variable called survey. Next, what we want to do is check to see if what we got back was a valid custom post type SSP survey. So first we check to see if the survey ID is not valid. So if it's 0, this will return true. So if the ID is 0 here, not 0 is equal to true. So then whatever will run here will run in there. So otherwise we check to see if it is a valid survey ID. So if it's greater than 0, then we check to see, well, is the post type that we got back when we called get post, is it equal to SSP survey, which is our custom post type? And if it's not, then we're going to run some code in here. Okay. So if the survey is not valid, then we're going to update our output to be some text here that says the requested survey does not exist. And so if our survey is valid, then we're going to run a bunch of code down here. So here's that. So we're going to start by creating a new variable called form, and then we're going to use this to store the HTML of our form for our survey. Next, we check to see if there is content in our content variable, and we're running a function built into PHP called string length. And this is just going to count how many characters are in that variable. So it's an empty string right now. This is going to return 0. That's also equal to false. So then this code won't run. But if there's more than one character in there, then this code next here will run. So then we set up our form string to be equal to this HTML right here. This is actually going to be the top of our form. So we're going to actually prepend the content that's being passed in above our form here. So we're wrapping it with a div class, giving it a class of SSP survey content. That's just so that we can target it later with custom CSS if we want. And then we're outputting the result of content. We're wrapping it inside of a built-in WordPress function called WP AutoP. And what it does is it automatically adds paragraph or P tags to content with line breaks and stuff like that. So it just formats our content a little bit for us. So below that, we're setting up a new variable called submit button to an empty string. Then we check to see if the form or the survey is not complete by the current user. So we do that by calling a function that we're going to write in a bit called SSP survey is complete, and we pass in the survey ID. That function will do some checking with our database to see if the current user's IP address is associated with a response for this survey already. And if it is, it'll return true, and if not, it'll return false. And then we're saying, so if they have not completed the survey, then put this, set this up as our submit button. If they've completed the survey, we don't want to display another submit your response button. We don't want the response a second time. So that it'll keep the submit button HTML to be an empty string, so there'll be no submit button. Below that, we continue building out our form now. So here we set up actual form opening and closing tags, and our form is going to have an ID of survey underscore, and then we append the unique ID of this particular survey, and then we're giving it a class as well as SSP survey form so that we can target it with CSS later. And then inside of our form, we're going to call another function, which we're going to write in a little bit, called get questions HTML. And this is going to just return formatted questions with radio buttons for us automatically. And then below that, we're going to include our submit button. So again, if they've completed this form, nothing will really get included here. But if they haven't, then the submit button that says submit your responses will get attached here. And then we close up our form tag, and now we've got our form HTML. So now that we've got our form HTML, we just append it to the output string by using .equals syntax, and that adds it to our output string. All right, so below everything here, we want to close the div tag that we opened up at the beginning of our HTML. So we do that. And then at the very bottom of our function, we want to return that output. So we do that. All right. So we've already covered that this function calls two new functions. That's the get questions HTML and the question is answered function that returns true or false. So we need to create those functions now. These are what I call helper functions. So what are helper functions? Well, this is my own way of categorizing functions that do menial tasks. So my definition would be a helper might do a quick calculation or format a string. Often helpers are called within other functions, like we've seen in our shortcode here. Helpers condense larger functions and make them easier to read. And above all, a helper should save you time by performing a repeated task in your code. So let's add these new helper functions now. Let's navigate to the helpers section, which is section 6. Hit return a couple times. All right, so the first one is going to be 6.1. This function is going to return HTML for our survey question. So that function was called getQuestionHTML. Okay, and it takes in one argument, which is survey ID, so that we can look for the specifics of that survey. So we're going to start by setting up our output string. This time we're going to call it HTML. It doesn't really matter what you call this variable as long as you're consistent with it throughout the function. And then next we're going to grab that survey object just like we did before using getPost and passing in the survey ID. And again here we do another check to see if it's a valid SSP survey post type. If it is, we want to get the question text, and we get that from the WordPress post type object, the post content, which is the text that we wrote in the editor. And so that'll come in here, so we can grab that and save it into our questions text variable. After that, we're going to set up our default radio button options values in an associative array. So we're going to call that array questions ops, and the values are going to look like this. So we've got the keys set to the text, and then the value of each key is going to be, I'm going to actually change this to be, instead of 0 to 4, I'm going to do 1 through 5 here. Just like that. Okay, so these are the keys, strongly agree, and then the value is going to be 5. This is the value that's going to get stored in our database table that we created in a previous lesson in the response ID column in our database. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the current user already has answered this survey question, and we do that by calling the question is answered function, which we're going to create next. And we just store the result in a variable called answered. So it's going to be true or false. After that, we're going to set up a new variable called complete class, and we're just going to default it to an empty string. So if the survey has been completed already, then we can check that here in our if statement. If it's not complete, then we're going to return the inputs. Otherwise, we're going to return a message that says, hey, thank you for completing our survey. So let's look at that here. So if the survey is not complete yet, then we're going to set up an inputs variable. And in that, it's going to have an unordered list. And each list item is going to contain the radio button and the value of the option available for the response. So let's look at that. So what we do here is we're going to loop over each of our options inside of our question ops array. And we're going to get the key and the value for each of those. And then what we're going to do is we're going to append another list item to our input string. And this is the HTML that's going to have all our inputs in it. So here we are setting up a list item with a label. Inside that label, we have an input, a radio button input, and we're setting the name to be SSP underscore question underscore, and then we're appending the survey ID. And then we're passing in the value coming in here from our loop. And then the label of this is going to be the text, like strongly agree, that comes in through the key here. And then once we've looped through all those, we close our unordered list below that. Otherwise, if the question has already been answered, we set up our complete class now to be equal to SSP question complete. And then we also set up our inputs to just be the text, thank you for completing our survey. All right, so below that, we want to tie everything together now. So again, at the beginning of our function, we created our output string variable and we called it HTML. So here we're appending all of this. We're joining all of these variables that we created together to create our completed HTML. So we've got a DL tag, and we're including a dynamic ID value here, which is going to be SSP underscore the survey ID and then underscore question. We're giving a class of SSP question, and then we're also appending the completed class in here. Remember, if it's not completed, it'll just be an empty string. If it is completed, then we get this class that we set up here. Below that, we in our DT tag, we've got our question text, which we set up at the very beginning, and then below that, in our between DD tags, we've got our inputs. So this is either going to be our message that says thank you for completing our survey, or it's going to be our unordered list with a list of our inputs and radio buttons. Okay, so now we've built our HTML. Now we can return it. So at the bottom of our function here, we just return HTML. So that's going to be the result. Okay, so again, we can see that this function is calling yet that other helper that we haven't created yet, and that's that question is answered helper function. So we're going to add that right now. We're going to add that right below this one right here. So we can just hit return a couple times. So here's that function. For now, we're actually not going to build out the full functionality of this function. We're just going to return false every time. And don't worry though, we'll complete this function in a later lesson. So this function is called question is answered. It takes the survey ID so that we can query that survey and look to see if the users answered it. But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to set up our return value to false, and then we're going to return that. So not much going on there right now. Okay, so we've created a couple of new functions, and we know that functions won't run unless we call them. So our register shortcode function that we called earlier, let's go to that. So this function is going to call add shortcode, which is going to add our new shortcode, register it with WordPress so that when we enter this text, it'll actually do something in our posts. But this function needs to be called yet, so we need to add a new hook for that. So in our hook section here below 1.2, hit return a couple times, and this is the new hook, 1.3. So we're using WordPress's add action function again, and we're adding our new function, the register shortcodes function, to the action init in WordPress. And init, it has been covered already in our concepts and definitions portion of this course, so feel free to go back to common actions and filters and look at what init does there. All right, so now is a great time to update our table of contents. So let's go there. We added the new hooks for shortcodes just now, so we can put that in there. And let's put in our new shortcodes functions that we created. And then we added 2 new helpers, so we can add those in here as well. Excellent. So make sure you save your PHP file now. Now let's go to WordPress and let's go to pages, and we're going to run a little test here. Let's create a new page. Let's call it surveys. And in here, we're going to try our new shortcode. So again, it was SSP survey ID, and we're just going to put a bogus ID in here now. And let's try out the content portion. So content is anything that appears between your shortcode's opening and closing tags. So we can do that just like this. So we're putting the text test content in here. Okay, so you can hit publish now and click view page. All right, so if everything worked correctly, you should be seeing this message that says the requested survey does not exist. And that's because the ID that we passed in, ID 123, that's not a valid survey ID. So to get a valid survey ID now, let's go back here to our WordPress dashboard and navigate to Snappy Surveys. Click on Surveys. I've created a couple test ones already, but I'll show you how to create one. Just click Add New, and we've got our title and our description here. So the title is just for the backend purposes. That won't display to users. So we'll just say test survey. And then for the survey question, as we just saw in our shortcode, the options to select are a range of between strongly agree to strongly disagree. So your question has to be a kind of question that can be answered like that. So let's say that chocolate ice cream is the best, okay? Which isn't really a question. It's kind of like a statement, actually. It's like a debate statement, right? In the affirmative. Okay, so now that we've created this, if you've hit update, you should see in the URL at the top in the address bar, there's something that says post equals, and then there's a number. So copy that number. That's the ID of this survey. Now we want to navigate back to pages, edit surveys, and change 123 here to that number that we just copied. Hit update. Click View Page. All right, looks like we're getting an error here. I'm just gonna debug this now. So it says call to undefined function survey is complete on line 122 in our plugin. So let's go to line 122 and check that out. All right, so here we're calling survey is complete. This was a mistake. We actually want to call question is answered. So that was just a typo there. Question is answered. All right, I'm just going to do a quick check to see if survey is complete is anywhere else in our code. Nope. Okay, good. So we should be able to save that now. And let's go back here and reload. All right, there we go. So there's our shortcode. It's displaying the survey. We've got our test content showing up. That's that content that we entered between our opening and closing shortcode tags. And then below this is the survey. So here's our question or statement, and then the different radio button responses that we're able to make. So if you're not seeing your survey show up, if you're seeing the shortcode text instead, you may have made a mistake when setting up your hooks for this lesson. So just go back and review that portion of the video again. Make sure that you did it correctly, that you have no spelling mistakes. So there you have it, guys. You've created your very own shortcode. So of course our form doesn't work yet, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at including custom scripts to eventually make our survey form work. So stay tuned, guys.